Okay, guys, welcome to another week of This Week with Brett Olds. I've got a guest on the show today. We're going to be talking about all kinds of things today. I'll probably get a few emails to the producer as well. I usually do want to have this guy on. I've got Dennis O'Connor with me. I think this is the second or third time that we've interviewed you. Third time, yeah. Welcome to the show, Dennis.
Thanks, Brett. Good to be here again.
Dennis is from Awakening in Health, for any new listeners to the show. He's been around, done a lot of things over the years. Scuba dive instructor, worked in ICU for 10 years, I think, as an ICU nurse. And now you obviously do your Awakening in Health stuff. But just over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, you've probably been a decade or more. I've probably been 5 years. My eyes have opened up to what the hell's been going on with the pharmaceutical world, which we talked about before. But I got you on the show today to talk about all manner of things. But I thought we'd start with censorship because we've witnessed it. I think everyone saw what happened over the last 3 years during COVID. But there's a new bill just been introduced to the federal parliament. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about this censorship bill 2023.
Yeah, it's fairly sinister, isn't it? And it's interesting for me to come from a different country, especially Ireland, and I think a lot of people don't realize the possible slippery slopes that can happen. And we hear about things like the Holocaust and whatnot, but in our history lessons in school, we were taught about times back in the 1700s, the 1800s, where even just for our expression of religion, we had to hide out in the bushes in the forests in order to pray. And I'm more agnostic than religious, but the point is that we're not very far away from having these jurisdictions that have been placed upon us in the past, where we see these people running rife with taking our liberties and taking our freedoms away. And I think for me to evaluate what I see happening in medicine, we have to be looking at two things, and I say this many times. The things we look at are history in general, and also the history of the financial system and the history of the medical industry. And when we see the atrocities that have been happening throughout the world with history, most people, I think, growing up now are not really fully aware of the impacts of them. And we look at situations in Vietnam, situations with Mao in China. And one of the first things that happened before the communist revolution in China was the absolute breakdown of the fabric of society. And you can really trace that back to some very Marxist ideas, and you can change that word around. I use that word Marxist loosely, where the fabrics of society get attacked first. And a person I like to refer to as well is, you might know this a fellow called Yuri Bezmenov.
Yep.
And he's had some interviews in the 80s.
He's a defector, wasn't he, from Soviet?
Yeah, he had interviews with a fellow who I have a great admiration for. He's still alive, a guy called G. Edward Griffin. And again, Griffin's another fellow I reference. He wrote an incredible book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. And Jekyll Island is an island off the coast of America where a meeting happened to put the Reserve Bank into power. And it was a very, very sinister kind of development where I'll just tangent slightly, but and again, we kind of said we'd meander a little bit, but one thing
we'll go wherever the conversation needs to go. Yeah.
One thing I think it's important to know is that the federal banks, people have an idea that they are in some way, or the reserve banks, affiliated. Well, they are affiliated, but they're in some way owned by us or owned by the governments. They're not. These banks are private companies.
Yeah, that's right.
And the way things work with these private companies is they lend money to the government, they charge the government interest, then they get this money back. So when we think that the government really are beholden to these central banks, so the governments really have to do what they're told. It looks like democracy. It smells like democracy. It acts like democracy. But when we are starting to dig down into things, you made a great comment just before we just went on air, Brett, about you attended a meeting, and you said, who wrote to our politicians about having transgenderism as the number one priority in our society when we have skyrocketing crime rates? Nobody did that.
Yeah, well, I was just to explain that I was at a meeting last week with the Senior Citizens Group. I got asked to come to a speech on juvenile crime, which is a state matter. But as a local councillor, I'd done a speech 3 months ago up in Palm Cove, and apparently people liked what I had to say, so I got invited down to this other one. And there's about 40 or 50 people in the room. And I asked the question because, they're all sitting there, all these senior citizens, a bit worried about their houses being broken into. All of them had either been broken into or knew someone or had a neighbour broken into. And I said to them, okay, well, because it's the state government, the crime falls under their remit. And I said, so you guys are angry, rightfully so, but you're being silently angry. So you're just angry and going to sleep and everything. How many of you have emailed your politicians to let them know that you're not happy with how the crime's going? And none of them had. And that was my recommendation to them. Like, don't abuse them, but just let them know you're unhappy. And I said, okay, so I want to take that question further. How many of you guys knew about a bill that passed literally 3 weeks ago in Queensland State Parliament? And I said, this bill has to do with transgenderism, where I said, we can all go and change on our birth certificate now, and I can say I identify as a woman. They'll change on my birth certificate, so now I can go in the female bathrooms and everything else and play sports. And I said, how many of you knew that? Only 3 people out of the room of 40 or 50, I didn't do a head count, but it was about that many. Only 3 people put their hand up. They knew that bill. And I said, okay, well, how many of you knew that bill? Because that's not the worst part of it. You can be 12 years old or up, and you can go change your birth certificate and not get your parents' consent. So, and only 2 hands went down. Only one person knew that was the extent of this new bill. And I said, okay, so how many of you in this room, because you haven't been emailing your MPs to tell them that you're disgusted with people breaking in your houses, stealing your cars, scaring your kids. You're not worried about getting lower taxes. You're not emailing about that. You're not emailing them about trying to get cheaper electricity or anything else. What your main concern is that you've been hounding your MPs about for the last 5 years is you want 12-year-olds to be able to change their gender without their parents' consent. Is that what you've all been emailing? And they kind of chuckled and laughed, and because I said, where are these politicians getting this information from that crime's not important, nothing else is important, you can defecate now, they've decriminalised. You should see the amount of faeces and urine. I was talking to some council workers in town yesterday, and the CBD, all over the CBD. I've got photos sent to me from shopfront owners. And they're sitting there going, this is disgusting, this is Cairns, we're a tourist city. Even if you weren't a tourist city, it doesn't matter. People shouldn't be shitting in your city and peeing wherever they want. And that's what's happened since they've decriminalised it. It's gone rampant. And I said, so they don't care about any of that, but what they really care about, what their feedback from the public, who are they representing? Because honestly, I can tell you, no one in the public has been saying this is something we need to do. And I think it comes back to your point. It's this breakdown. One lady asked me, well, why is the state doing it in your opinion? And I'm like, I honestly don't know, but I guess it is. They obviously, I don't believe in coincidence. I don't believe these people are stupid. It must be about the breakdown of society, breaking down that fabric in society. And you mentioned Mao before in China. I had a good mate of mine. I saw him last weekend in Melbourne. I hadn't seen him for probably a year or two. He'd just done 3 weeks in China. He absolutely loved it, by the way. He said it was beautiful, clean, everything. But he was walking through Tiananmen Square. He showed me a photo. They still celebrate Mao big time. They've got this huge framed picture in Tiananmen Square of Mao. He's still really celebrated over there. And he's the biggest tyrant
mass
murder in history, and he's still celebrated. I'm like, wow, but I am digressing too. But I was coming back to your point to explain why I said about that transgenderism. Our politicians aren't making decisions in the best interest of the public. Like you said, it looks like democracy, it smells like democracy. It's the illusion of choice too. You've got these two parties which are basically the same. You've got people like Jared Rennick, who stands out, asks questions, he's very well educated, well spoken and articulate, and then the LNP drop him. He's not going to be for the next election in the Senate in 2 years' time. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? They just show you, mate. It's the uni party. These two, they have slight differences to give you the illusion of choice. But I'm really frustrated at the moment with what both our state and federal governments are doing and not representing the people. I don't know whether, and this, I'll bring it back to the censorship bill that I asked about at the start. Like, maybe that's the reason why is it's the they want to degrade our fabrics, the society. But I just can't believe that so many people are going along with it. Do they not know? Are they not paying attention? How many people out there, my listeners, are and write in, email in if you've heard about this censorship bill that they're bringing in. It's still got to be debated, vote on, and go through the Senate. But the fact that they're talking about this should be ringing alarm bells to everyone. It should scare the absolute crap out of all of us that our governments are thinking about literally bringing in laws. They've already shown their censorship, what they'll do with social media through the pandemic, which wasn't even a pandemic anyway. But people that just ask simple questions, people that at first said, hey, wait a second, we don't think these vaccines do stop transmission because look at the information from the Israeli government, look at the information from the UK government, from the Yellow Book system, look at the evidence. I don't think it stops transmission. They got censored and kicked off Twitter. People that said This doesn't stop you catching COVID. This doesn't stop you transmitting it. It got kicked off because that was a lie. The Ministry of Truth, the Orwellian Ministry of Truth, and what was that? The Prime Minister of New Zealand, what was Jacinda Ardern? We will be your single source of truth. I mean, these tyrants, and we did it here in Australia too, they kick people off for asking these questions, which have now been proven to be true. Taking these injections didn't stop you catching COVID, didn't stop you. So it comes back to, but at the time that was seen as, they censored those people. Now they're going to bring it into law and bring fines in. I think it's up to $500,000 or $650,000 if you get caught, and if these social media platforms allow you and me to put a post up and say something like that in the future about climate change, about anything. If they decide, and it's ACMA, I forget what it stands for, ACMA, they're going to be the body that decides if what you put on Twitter or Facebook or what I put on there is disinformation or misinformation. If it is, huge fines.
There's so many things to dig into there, Brett, but one of the things that kind of strikes me as you're talking is the capability for that censorship. And as you correctly pointed out, I had about half my videos taken down on YouTube for asking questions about peer-reviewed journals and peer-reviewed articles and citing experts and citing doctors. So what we're being given in those circumstances is a one-sided narrative. So if you take away, let's say, I don't know, 1,000 scientists, 2,000 scientists who disagree with climate change, you have consensus. And believe me, there are plenty of scientists who disagree with climate change.
I don't know, 97% agree, remember? 97%.
Yep, correct. The same with the medical industry. And the other thing which is really appalling, and people have to understand the severity of this, are services like Twitter, services like Facebook are massive carriers or carriages of disseminating child pornography. Now, for the last 15, 20 years, that is still going on. There are still heinous things on these services, which I'm glad to say I've never stumbled across them. Apparently, they're very easy to access. So how can it be that in a click of a finger, you can wipe out any discourse going against the given agenda in relation to climate change, in relation to forced medical procedures, but for some reason they can't tackle something like child pornography? So we know that the capabilities are there for this rife censorship. But the other thing is, which is incredibly important, is this idea of binary choice. And this is a very insidious, kind of slow creep. The fact that it's either one or the other. It's Labour or Liberal. It's Democrat or Republic. Yep. It's Coles or Woolies. It's Pepsi or what's it called? Coca-Cola. Okay? So the idea is that it has to be either one or the other without that nuance. And this is what I see creeping into the narrative of the papers, which I find very unsettling, is that if you have a position that you don't think it's right to, let's say again, mutilate a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old male or female, then you are what's it called? Transphobic.
Yeah, I was going to say sexist, genderist. I don't know what they call it these days.
But then they're also lumping this in together with that you are far right, or you are anti-vax.
They want to put you in a pigeonhole. You put you in a category.
Absolutely, and I'm not too sure. Again, if people really look into this, the whole far right narrative is an absolute fallacy. It's made up. The white supremacists in America, the amount of the general population, who are extreme radicals is absurdly minute. But if you have a view that might align with something like that, you're already painted as that dissident. So, for example, if we're not aware of this, if we're not looking to stop this kind of stuff, people like you and me, Brett, could be sharing a cell together in 6 months to a year.
Oh, I've got no doubt that people like you and me is who they're coming after, 100%. And I do try and come from a common sense. Like sometimes people are like, oh, you jump down rabbit holes. And sometimes I do, because when you peel that first layer of the onion back, there's always a second layer. And when you ask one question and either you don't get an answer or you get lied to over that answer, it forces you to ask that second question. So, but I always do try and come from a common sense background. And if I say something on my radio station or in government, local government, I make sure I've got the receipts to back it up. I make sure I've done my research, and I can say something boldly and back it up with facts. So even someone like me, I honestly believe that they absolutely come from people like you and me. They don't want us asking questions. And just to go back to ACMA, I just Googled it. It's the Australian Communications and Media Authority. So they're going to have the authority to shut you down. Now, like I said, this bill still has to be debated. It's not in its final form. But the fact that they're looking at shutting people, and it's just not like me and you, it's anyone out there that asks a question that goes against the narrative. And guess what? The government is exempt from these new rules that will come in. So the government, it's Orwellian. It's that 1984 George Orwell book where it was called the Ministry of Truth.
That's right.
We will be, and Jacinda Ardern, she verbalised it. She literally said, we will be your single source of truth. Don't listen to anyone else. And I'm like, wow. Science doesn't work that way, by the way, just for anyone out there that's not aware. Science is about healthy debate, about peer reviewing, and a peer review is someone that's got the same kind of rank or professional as you. They try and disprove your theory. They try and look at it, and with respect, they don't sit there and try and trash it, but they try and find holes in it to make sure that your theory is sound. You have to have debate. You have to have questions.
Well, even there's a fallacy there, Brett. There's a few things to actually look at. But peer review is another massive scam.
Oh, it is these days. I'm saying what it's supposed to be.
Correct.
Yeah, no, what it's turned into.
The whole premise of science is to challenge any narrative, not to stick with one that's existing. Yeah. Otherwise, the whole area of science would not exist if it wasn't about challenging a thesis.
100%.
This is what science is about, and then following it up with information, either to validate that thesis or to destroy the premise. And again, there's so many places you can go with this, isn't there? We had this idea of, well, how could it be this global conspiracy? And when you're talking about this bill with ACMA in Australia, the same thing's happening in Ireland.
It happened in Canada too, by the way.
The same thing, correct, is happening in Canada. There's another bill that's really similar happening in England. So we have this word called lockstep. Everybody, these global leaders, following this tune. So it seems almost too preposterous for people to think that all these governments can't just be doing the same thing. If the central banks own you, lock, stock and barrel, which they do, and they're telling you what to do, you walk in lockstep because you get paid very well and you get favours. Yeah, I
don't believe in coincidences anymore. And just for any new listeners tuning in, I'm talking to Dennis O'Connor. As the show's this week with Brett Olds. I'm Brett Olds. And we're just having a conversation about some of the craziness that's going on in the world right now. But you're right, the central banks that own, I think 8 of our banks, our main banks in Australia, the 8 biggest ones, are all owned by the central bank. They've got the governments of the world, of Australia, of Canada, of all these countries are run by the central banks. And when we said earlier, and you said they charge the government's interest, just replace that word government with they charge us residents. We're the ones paying it. But Canada, they brought in this exact same thing that Australia's putting a bill in for. You said Ireland, and there's a few other countries doing it. It's not a coincidence. It's whether it's the people, the moustache twirlers behind the central banks, the World Economic Forum. It makes me look. There's a bunch of unelected people, billionaires, the world's richest people, get together once a year in Davos, Switzerland. They get together a lot more than that, but they have their big meeting in Davos in Switzerland. And they decide which way they think the world's going to go. And so people say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, no, there are conspiracy theories and there are conspiracy facts. And you've explained the definition of a conspiracy a couple times on my show. A conspiracy is just when 2 or more people get together and have a plan to do something. So governments do that. People do that in their day-to-day in their friendship groups, you know. There are always conspirators and instances of conspiracies. Theories are when you just get the wild ones like, oh, we think it's this and that, and it's an alien invasion or lizard people and who knows, all that stuff. But we're not saying that. We're just saying there are governments all around the world starting to do the exact same thing, introduce the exact same bills. When the so-called pandemic hit us, all the governments got in lockstep and delivered all these similar policies except for Sweden. Sweden used our policy that we had written for 20-odd years, and they followed that. And they've had, and comparatively with all the countries around them, they had much better results. They didn't mandate things. They said, look, do the right thing. Here's what we recommend, but you choose what you want to do. But you've got all these people doing the same thing. And then you've got the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations. And I think their biggest financiers are China, the Chinese Communist Party, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are the 2 biggest. And you follow the money, 99.9 times out of 100, you'll find out what the real story is. Follow the money, guys. What's going on? Then after that pandemic, all our countries, America, Canada, the UK, Australia, we're all 100% on board to vote for the Pandemic Health Treaty bill. And if it wasn't for 54 other countries, including Brazil, China, India, a bunch of countries in Africa, they said no way. And so the bill is still on the table. It's been pulled, hadn't been voted on. and they're going to try and bring it back in some other form, that in the next pandemic, it can be a virus, it can be a climate change, it could be a pandemic of obesity. They can name whatever their pandemic is, and this is written into their bill. They get to name it. They don't have to bring any facts to back it up. They can just say, no, there's a pandemic, and then the World Health Organization will tell every country that's involved, which I think all 192 countries have signed up with the United Nations, is all 160. I forget how many. It's the majority of the world, and in Australia, our country is one of them, and our country is wanting to sign up to this and have every decision made for us by these unelected bureaucrats at the United Nations, they're all linked in, from the World Economic Forum to the United Nations, World Health Organization, and I just think, guys, wake the hell up.
So just to clarify a few things, but the World Health Organization in particular is very, very sinister, and I'd encourage everybody to look at a documentary by Lillian Frank called Trust Who, which is Trust the World Health Organization, and she does a remarkable job. It's quite old now, in tracing back their origins from coming from the tobacco industry. And she also describes that the majority of their funding actually doesn't come from maybe individually people like Bill Gates in China, but collectively the majority of their funding comes from the pharmaceutical industry. And to give a little bit more context, I mean, why would people listen to me? Who the hell am I? But I made an inglorious exit from mainstream health. I was a clinical nurse consultant, and then I was a clinical nurse in areas, as you said, like intensive care and mental health. And one of the reasons for my exiting, and this is before this pandemic came about, was challenging the efficacy of antidepressants. And in spite of absolutely rock solid peer-reviewed science, I was getting my concerns knocked back. And to give you some examples, I face some situations in mental health where it is absolutely categorical that when you start some people on some antidepressants, their rates of suicidality and self-harm go up dramatically within the first 4 to 6 weeks. Now, I was facing situations where I was not allowed to tell clients or patients about that.
About the risk. And where's the informed consent?
Absolutely. So from that point on, and this would be, 7 or 8 years ago for me, I really got quite incensed by that. So I went on a bit of a deep dive into, I guess, looking more at the pharmaceutical industry and the harms involved with it. And so I'm particularly painful for people to talk to, because my background, I've got a foot firmly in that structure, so I'm very difficult to deal with because I know how it works, and I also know how to look at research, and I know how to talk about research. And what you find is a lot of this research is based on these strawmans or these false premises.
Yep.
And if you take the premise away, you've got very, very little left. So then back to the World Health Organization, and I can't remember the other little three-letter agency, but the definition of pandemic was changed before COVID. It was literally changed in the dictionary. So now we've got this absolutely ludicrous loose criteria which can have these organizations declare a pandemic. Once you have a pandemic declared, there's all sorts of things that can be actioned, including insurances. And I'm not sure if people are aware, but there were massive bets with insurance about bonds that were released that were going to run out. And if those bonds had run out before a pandemic actually happened, these massive companies would have lost billions and billions of money. So when a pandemic actually happened in, 21?
2020, I think they declared it in 2020.
These bonds had to be paid. So all these companies had massive payouts because there was actually a pandemic. Now listen, I don't know, but if my mechanic, I don't know, just had a couple of coincidences and all of a sudden I was getting charged $5,000, and I think you'd be considered stupid if you didn't say, hey, was this work really done? But for some reason, because we've got a trusted organization or a trusted agency, and I use that word trusted very, very loosely, we're meant to sit back and go, oh no, they're trusted. We don't ask any questions. So the coincidences and the stink involved with these coincidences, once you start looking into it, is horrendous. I don't give a shit. I'm proudly a conspiracy theorist at this stage because I'm looking for new ones. Well, most of my old ones came through.
Yeah, that's right. 67-0. I think I met one guy the other day, but It's right, and it was the greatest, and even mainstream media, who's is complicit. They're just answering to their bosses. Everyone's got a boss. Their corporation they answer to. They've got the same bosses that our governments have, it seems, because they've not telling anyone about this transgender bill that just got passed 3 weeks ago. But they've come out and said this was the biggest wealth transfer that our world has ever seen, is what just took place over this pandemic. So then you start asking, what's the true origins? Why did we have a pandemic? Because when you look at the stats, and I forget, like you said, they've changed the dictionary definition of what a pandemic can or can't be, or is or isn't. But they, I think our death rate in Australia, our average lifespan is 82 years for a male, and I think it's 84 for a female. And the average death of a COVID person was 84 for a male and 86 for a female, older than the current, what you expect someone to live or die. So we didn't have a pandemic. It's like we had maybe not even a hugely bad flu season. It was just like it was a bad flu season.
And even the fact that I've got to say, because I'm going to post this on my YouTube,
Yep.
I'm going to have to ask us to slow down in that conversation, because the very first chat we did lasted on my YouTube channel for 24 hours. And it got deleted, and then you get a strike, then you can't post anything, and if you get 3 strikes, you're out. So I've got a lot of work there that would have just absolutely gone. So we're going to have to pull that side of the conversation into a member's own. We're going to have to section that off,
because we're talking about
because this conversation will get our video taken down on YouTube.
Wow.
So think about that. And the other thing you said as well, which has to be absolutely highlighted as being so significant, is the transfer of wealth.
Yep.
And I really want to focus on that for a second. So we have all these businesses that were crucified during the last 3 years, but the big boys weren't. We could still go to the bottle shops, which are owned by Woolies and Coles, and then, indirectly by Vanguard and these other massive, massive corporations. All these people got richer. Gates got richer. Musk got richer. You name it.
BlackRock,
but
State Street.
the people on the ground, we were crucified. The mom and pop businesses. I read a statistic in New York. Something like 60-70% of all mom and pop businesses died. They went under. Some of them were 150, 200 years old.
Oh, mate, this has been... I mean, and here's a conspiracy theory, because I haven't got the receipts to bring this to you, because I haven't got the documents. But I know some extremely wealthy people in Australia. And I'm not trying to brag or name anything else. I'm just trying to say, in 2009, I think it was, Julia Gillard was our Prime Minister. She had a lunch, and I've said this on my radio show before, and they invited the top dogs from each industry, and this lunch that I know about was in the construction building industry. So I'm not going to name, because I can't, I don't want to get in trouble. No, but you could imagine, just think of the big boys. And the premise of that conversation, and this was a family friend, didn't want to tell us for a while, but after a few beers, the premise of the conversation in 2009 was what we want, what we're being asked to do. This is Julia Gillard having a lunch, the Prime Minister of our country, with all the bureaucrats and everything around. And the premise of that conversation was, we want 3 to 5 big businesses in each industry to run everything, and everything runs under them because it's just easier to manage and everything else. And so basically what they're saying is they wanted to get rid of ma and pa businesses. She told them this at this lunch in 2009, and then we thought, oh wow, it sounds far out there. Like, no, that's conspiracy. And at the time, I even thought, oh, bull BS, bull dust. But I'm trying not to swear on the radio too much. I've already let a couple go, and I apologise to people out there with sensitive ears. But then I watching what happened from 2020 onwards, I've been like, wow. And it came to me one afternoon, and I said to my brother, do you remember this conversation? And he's like, hell yeah, I do. I said, look what's happening right now. Who's been the Harvey Normans of the world, the Woolworths, the Dan Murphys, the Bunnings? They didn't suffer during COVID. They all got massive. In fact, they got massive handouts that even when they made a profit, they didn't have to hand back. The ma and pa businesses all suffered. They were all coming to us, and the Chamber of Commerce here in Cairns was standing up for the government. I mean, Patricia O'Neill, who's the head of the Chamber of Commerce at that time, was the vice president of it. She came into council chambers, and I'd moved a motion trying to get us to simply write a letter to Anastasia on behalf of the small businesses in Cairns, because I'm telling you, like you know, a lot of these businesses, the FNQ Businesses United, they came together, and I can't tell you how many different business owners came to me and said, Oldsy, will you please just get your council to listen and write a letter saying you're against these mandates that are coming in December 16th, 2021. That's all I simply asked, was that we would write a letter backing the businesses, and the mayor got Patricia O'Neill to come in and read out a statement backing the government, saying this is the right thing to do. We back you. The mandates. I'm like, your job's supposed to be to represent these businesses. It just blew my mind in little Cairns that this was going on. What's the one just north of where Yeppoon is, just north of Rockhampton? There's the council, the Shire there. They were the first ones to write to the government and say this is BS. Now they still had to comply when the government wrote but at least they wrote a letter to back their business owners. Our council chose not to. 3 of us, I think, 4 of us voted to do it, but we got outvoted 6-4. And I was just like, it's just a simple letter telling the Premier we're not happy with this. But I'm like, why? And I knew, but at the time, I'm like, I know why they're doing this. They're attacking small business because their ultimate plan, whether it takes a decade or 5 decades, 50 years, who knows, is to get rid of it. 90% of Australians are employed, make money through small business. Small to medium enterprise is who they work for. We get rid of that. Again, it's just bringing in, and people are like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. I thought so too in 2009 when I heard this, guys. I don't believe it's a conspiracy theory anymore. I can't prove what I just told you because I heard it directly from the person that was in the meeting, but I can't get them to write an affidavit for you because they wouldn't.
But do you have to prove it? Or a part of my job is not to tell anybody that I'm right or wrong. Part of my job is to, or what I feel I have
just
to do,
float a theory.
Absolutely float things out there and then get people to look for themselves. And what we're saying has if you start joining some dots together, it's actually making a lot of sense. Why do you think all these regulations of business? I know business owners in Cairns and the hoops that they have to jump through, this regulation here, that assessment there, all this is a way of pulling their money, reducing their profits, reducing their margins, and they fold. So then you have the big boys who've already got all the boxes ticked, who can just swoop in and all of a sudden you've got these homogenized brands that are just everywhere and you don't have a choice. But the big thing I want to, again, throw down, and a lot of the work I do with my clients is related to depression and anxiety.
Yep.
Okay. And this is, I can go off on different tangents here, but I'll try and stick to the conversation we're talking about. But nearly everybody I talk to has no idea that serotonin, which is the chemical for your happiness,
the happy drug, yeah.
It's produced in your stomach.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that either.
It's produced in your stomach, 85 to 95%.
I should be the happiest guy on the planet. Look at the size of this one.
So if you have weight issues, there's a problem. Your serotonin's affected. Now I'm going in a particular direction with this. So all of a sudden, you don't have your Rusty's Market here in Cairns, for example, your local farmers.
Yeah.
Okay. So all of a sudden, you've got to buy all your vegetables from these big farms in Brisbane or Bilger or wherever it is.
Genetically modified.
Absolutely, genetically modified. Not only that, massively sprayed. One of the worst things that ever happened to humanity is a thing called glyphosate, which is put out by a company called Monsanto who also do all their GMO crops. And these things affect your gut. They affect your stomach. They compromise your serotonin. So indirectly, or even I'd say directly, these decisions to wipe out local, regional, small, self-sustaining, healthy businesses will have a massive effect on things like anxiety, depression, cancer, heart disease, you name it. So these so seemingly non-connected dots are all.
It seems innocuous, doesn't it? It's like, oh, it's just fertilizer.
Absolutely, yes. absolutely. So these things are all very connected, and they boil down to our health being massively, massively compromised.
No, I have to agree. I haven't studied it. I've heard of Monsanto before and what they've done with all their fertilizers. But I've been trying to keep up with what's been going on in Netherlands, in the Dutch farmers over there. There was huge revolts because what happened, and it's happening in other countries too. I believe they did it in India, and they go to the farmers and they say they bring in legislation and say you have to reduce emissions. Of course, it's all about climate change because that's everyone cares. All these multi-billionaires, the richest people in the world, who in every single movie you've watched since a kid, they're always the bad guy. But no, these guys don't care about anything except us. They care about us so much that they want to block out the sun, they want to, save the planet. They've gone in and got these governments to change legislation to say, look, because of climate change, we need you to use this fertilizer. And the first year they use it, they get a decent crop. And it's all GMO stuff, it's genetically modified. But the second year and every year after that, the crops don't yield, like sometimes 40% less. And the farmers were going broke. You can't run a farm like that. And so these Dutch farmers, they took to protests. I think, was it Belgium is one of the neighbours, and even German farmers, they started protesting with them, and the government was shutting down. They were shutting down highways and everything else. And it's all about, they're saying, because what they're trying to do is take over these farms and not have them, get rid of it, create a food shortage as well, or You can only grow our fertilisers, our this and that. And I think, was it the Belgium government just last week? The Prime Minister just resigned. The whole government imploded. And it was over the farmers have revolted. Now, the Netherlands, I believe it was 2 months ago, and I'm sorry, guys, I didn't know the conversation was going today, so otherwise I would have had some paperwork with the stats in front of me. I believe the farmers actually got organised. The Dutch farmers got organised. They formed a political party, and in their elections 3 or 4 months ago, they won, and they're controlling the country now. They won most of the seats in the Senate, and I think they even took over their lower house. So I'll have to double check on lower house over there. But the Dutch farmers got organised, formed a political party, and won the elections, smashed the elections. Now, that doesn't mean everything's fixed. No, not yet, it's not. But that's a fantastic power of the people coming together story. But do some research in the Netherlands, guys. Have a look into what's going on in Belgium right now. And I say this too with renewable energy, and I know we're jumping everywhere, and it's my fault. I apologise. Because I think it's... Oh, sorry, I just hit my microphone. They're all connected, I think. And I'm sorry for smashing the microphone. But it's... you look at renewable energy, and in Australia, we're trying to do what no other country on this earth has managed to do. And they've been in other countries like Germany and America and everyone, they've been trying to do it way longer than us, and they cannot do it with renewables. They're going back to coal, they're going back to nuclear. And Australia's like, no, we're pushing forward. We're going to be net zero by 2032 and 2050 and all this ridiculous blindfolded decisions that we're running to in the dark. And I just think the only people that are going to be harmed by this and pay the ultimate price is the general families like us. The average punter is going to suffer because of what they're doing with this renewables thing, and it's the same thing with the farmers. They're coming after them. We got in Australia in the 1970s. And I only learned about this when Pauline Hanson brought up about 5 years ago. There was a conscious decision made that Australia was going to stop manufacturing white goods, textiles, and everything else, and eventually stop manufacturing cars, which we did. We don't manufacture anything. We don't even process our own minerals. That was a conscious decision our government made back in 1973, I believe it was, but it was in the early 70s. And they said, we're going to help these developing nations like India and China, and we're going to impact negatively our own citizens to help these developing countries. And you can't say China's a developing country anymore. They're way ahead of us in so many regards, but we still are honouring this decision that was made in the 70s. And when you talk to the average person in the street, they don't know that. They think I'm crazy when I say it. I said they voted on it. There was a decision made in government, but no social media back then. But even if there was, they wouldn't look now. The media's not covering anything. That doesn't serve the public. The governments are supposed to work for the population of Australia, and I guarantee you, put a referendum out there, no one would have voted for that.
Now, if I were a suspicious character, and I am, and if I was in substantial control of the world, and I wanted to get more control of the world, do you think it would benefit me if I wanted to take over Australia to have Australia producing all their own things, or would it benefit me more to have control over giving Australia whatever they wanted, and then at the flick of a switch, withhold that, turn it off, because I'm controlling imports and exports? Do you think I could maybe have the country at my beck and call if that happened?
Yeah, 100%. Someone said this to me a couple of years ago before I really was not as I used to be so trusting about government, because I used to think, going back a couple of decades, even 15 years ago, 10 years ago, been thinking, they make some dodgy decisions at times, but at the end of the day, I had the old Australian attitude, she'll be right. And it's like, no, I know the governments, they'll make dodgy things here, they'll do some good things there. At the end of the day, they've got our best interests at heart. They just see things from a different point of view, and I was just going about my business. Ignorance was bliss, And now I don't trust the governments at all because of all this stuff. And someone said to me back, I think it was 8 years ago, they said, okay, Holsey, if, like you said, if there's a sinister character, if there was a cabal, or if there was this moustache twirlers in the background controlling things, either the World Economic Forum, either the Rothschilds, the Rockefeller, whatever conspiracy people want to believe, whoever it is pulling the strings, they said, if there was, I said, Holsey, what would they be doing differently than what's happening right now? So, and I thought about that. I'm like, actually, like you just said, and that's what people out there, and I'm not saying it is the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, or anything else. I'm just floating it out there for the listeners. Have a think about this, because things are heading a certain direction. They used to nudge. They used to call it nudging. When you move a society along over a period of a decade or more, just you slowly push them and you take away a few liberties here and there. But we didn't get nudged the last 3 years. There was a giant push. Like, they rushed through so many tyrannical laws and everything else, and the people really didn't push back that hard. So I think that the nudging's going to go away, and I think over the next decade, maybe less, they're going to just keep doing what they've done, just push us and push us into and I'm like, what would they be doing? If they're doing it for our benefit, what are the benefits? I can't see any. I see small businesses hurting. I see the average families out there hurting. So show me where the benefits are for all these things. And people are like, it's the planet. We're saving the planet. I think it's personally the man-made, like climate change is a real thing. Obviously, I can't say obviously to anything these days, but we've had ice ages, we've had we've had warming and cooling of the Earth for apparently millennia, for millions of years or billions, some people say. So yeah, climate change absolutely does change. Does happen. Like the sun, if it heats up too much, our atmosphere heats up and expands instantly. But the man-made climate change stuff, so we got told by the Climate Council Australia a couple of years ago that the Great Barrier Reef, twice in its last million years, has been totally dead. Like the ocean receded and then came back in the Great Barrier. And I said to this lady that said that, I said, excuse me, can you repeat that? I said, so you're telling me the Great Barrier Reef totally died off and came back, and then totally died off and came back again over the last million years? She goes, yes. She's thinking, did I stutter, you idiot? And I said, okay, well, I'm just guessing the million years ago, or 500,000 years ago, there was no man-made, there was no fossil fuels, right? The Industrial Revolution hadn't started yet. She goes, no. And then all of a sudden you see her eyes start to think, oh, I know where he's going with this. I said, so wait a second. So if the reef is dying, which it's not, the Australian Institute of Marine Science just came out earlier this year, or December or January, I think, and said the reef's bigger than it's ever been in recorded history. There's more reef than we've had. It's great. And I go out there diving all the time, and it's beautiful. And I said, so okay, if the reef is going to die, why are you attributing that to climate, to man-made climate action, to the industrial age, because of carbon dioxide that we're putting in the air, when 500,000 years ago it didn't exist and it died anyway? And she, I understand what you're saying. Click, and she's moved forward and kept going with her thing. Didn't want to answer that question, but I get frustrated with just what we're told to accept. Facts don't matter. Stop asking questions. Here's a narrative. Just swallow what you've got, what we're telling you. And then when that question was asked me 8 years ago, it didn't really sink into probably 3 years later. I was like, back to your point, and I've gone a big long circle here, but what would they be doing differently if their end goal wasn't to get more control? And Australia being self-sufficient wouldn't be a good thing if you wanted to have control of Australia. Either whoever runs the central banks wanted to have control. What would they be doing differently? And even so it doesn't take a lot of picking to destroy some of these narratives. And they talk about carbon neutral or carbon negative. We're all carbon based. Every living thing is carbon based. So essentially to have true reduction in carbon, you should just kill all life. That's really what it means. It's just I was told, again, this is more anecdotal, so it's hard to, I should have written down this fella's name, but I've got a friend of mine who is very clever. He's an agronomist. He does a lot of stuff with soil. And he's a what? Agronomist?
An agronomist.
Okay,
so that's a person who treats soil. And he was out on a boat again on the reef last week with one of the world experts on the reef. And the conversation which I've had with some people in the past before, so I'm not actually stating this as fact. I'm stating this more as look into this and see what you can pull up when you hear it. But we've got this massive Crown of Thorns program, because the Crown of Thorns are invading the reef and they're going to destroy it, and it's the next big catastrophe. It's like the locusts. And this fella, he's in his 90s apparently. He's done a lot of global work, including a lot with JCU. Is just unequivocal. He's just very, very definite about this, that the Crown of Thorns, their job is to clean up the reef. They only eat sick reef. And he relates this back to the poisons that are being pumped in from the farms, which again comes back to institutes like Monsanto. And the same old fellow was telling me, he was talking to one of his fellows who supplies lots of plants and things for the big two, Coles and Woolies. But apparently you cannot supply any vegetables to Coles and Woolies without having set measures of atrazine and glyphosate, of your poisons sprayed on them, okay, from Monsanto Poisons. Then once those vegetables are delivered to Coles and Woolies and they're sold, Monsanto again gets a kickback from the levels of sales. So it's like win-win-win. So it's all based, and this is why, I don't know if people know, but I'll throw this out there. This is why we have to have genetically modified crops, because the poisons that we put on the crops, normal crops couldn't cope. We would kill them. The weed killer and the pesticides would kill the crops. So they have to be genetically modified because the stuff we're putting on them is too toxic. That's okay? Crazy, yeah. And then what we're doing, as part of the way I treat health, is one of the big things I tell people is if they are eating in Coles and Woolworths, if they're buying all this fresh-looking produce, they're going to kill themselves eventually. You do not buy stuff from Coles and Woolworths if you want to stay healthy, and that's fairly powerful. That's happening with our animals, or cows, or pigs.
I wasn't laughing because I was just laughing. I wonder if they're sponsors of the station. I might get in trouble.
Yeah,
I don't think they are.
But people need to know this stuff. The animals are poisoned. They're sick. They're getting all these things thrown down their mouths, injected into them. And the milk we're getting, the dairy. When people say dairy is bad, yeah, it kind of is now. But back in the day, normal dairy was fantastic. It was almost a medicine. So we're just again, it's just so fascinating and so wild for me to once you see this bigger picture, like you said before, if we had these sinister people in the background, the cabal, whatever you want to call them, and they wanted to depopulate the earth, what kind of things would they be doing? I'll tell you what, every time I'm looking around and doing more investigations, all the things that you might suggest they would be doing, it seems that that's happening. Now make of that what you will.
Well, look, you think about it, and you brought up a good point about geoengineering, right? Years ago, and what do they call them? Chemtrails?
Yeah.
I had a family member mention that to me probably a decade ago, and I laughed. And I said, oh, come on. They're not spraying the air. And as if they can modify, they modify the weather. Yeah. And then in the Beijing Olympics, I think was that 2008?
Yeah.
No, that was London Olympics. I don't know what year it was.
I think it was Beijing. I think
Beijing,
you're right. Yeah.
They had so much smog and everything over the city. The news was saying, well, what they've done is they've gone up and they've put up those little aluminium
particles,
and particles, and they've made it rain, and that's brought all the smog down. So when the Olympics happen in a week's time, it's going to be clear skies, and because they were worried about the athletes breathing in that crap air, and I remember that at the time, and I'm like, wait a second, so they're admitting now you can cause it to rain, you can do this thing, and other people like Brett, they've been doing it for years. Apparently in the 60s, Australia had a legislation in for geoengineering, and I've seen that document just recently, over the last 12 months, 18 months, and I'm like, oh wow, but I never really paid attention, didn't realise you could. And then you've got the HAARP, HAARP, which is, I think it's a United States run program, and they're talking about they can create earthquakes and tornadoes, and I'm like, what? So when you start again, it's that onion. You peel back the first layer, you ask a question, and then the chemtrail thing comes in, and you start listening to people like, wait a second, maybe that's not as crazy as when my family member said it a few years ago, and I was laughing at them. Maybe I need to go apologise to them and say, hey, I'm not saying you're 100% right, but you might have been onto something, because my ignorance, and it's easy to laugh at someone when they say something or to put them down that you don't understand. And I've been guilty of that in my life, and so I understand. Some people will point at me and laugh. That's why I say, if I'm saying it publicly, I always try and bring the receipts. And that's why I pre-referenced what I was saying earlier about the 2009 meeting, because I can't prove that meeting happened. I was told firsthand by someone that was there, but they're not going to sign an affidavit. So I really do try, and if I'm publicly speaking as an elected member, I've got to make sure I've got my facts. But if I'm going to just float a theory, I always try and let you know, hey, this is just an idea. And I'm not saying chemtrails are real. I'm just saying I shouldn't have laughed at the person that told me that, because now thinking about and looking at it and what they can do with weather and everything, maybe it's not as crazy as half-cocked as I first thought it was. That's not saying I 100% believe anything or don't, or I'm asking you to believe anything or don't, but I do think we should be asking more questions. And right back to the start of this conversation, we talked about the censorship bill that's coming in. That's going to stop these kind of conversations. We won't be able to put it up on any social media anywhere, and the mainstream won't touch it. And I don't even think this station, if that law comes in, would be able to play this interview. So I don't see that. That's not a good thing. People should never be afraid of questions or debate. And not violence or anything. Someone starts coming in just cursing and just throwing out random stuff. That's not healthy. That's not a constructive debate. But people should be able, even if it's a stupid question, ask your stupid question and we'll answer it. And we'll answer it and let you know why that was a bit of a silly question. But you shouldn't be afraid of questions. But that's what seems to be happening.
More of a Brett, when you just look back at history, things like Agent Orange, Tuskegee, they left syphilis run rife.
So the African American apologies,
correct.
Yeah.
And they've issued public apologies for this. There's
that was only in the 60s.
That's right.
Yeah.
This stuff is recent.
People are still alive that went through that, and then they're wondering why are they being vaccine hesitant?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not like our government doesn't not have a record of harming us. They do.
Or the pharmaceutical companies themselves.
Absolutely. I think I reference often
The biggest criminals in history.
Is a couple of years ago. If people have a look, have you noticed there's no baby powder, Johnson & Johnson baby powder on the shelves anymore?
I hadn't noticed, no.
Okay, have a look. It's gone. You know why? Because in America, Johnson & Johnson lost one of the biggest cases in history. I think I'm just pulling figures here, so I could be off with this. I think it was $2.6 billion, where it was categorical that they knew they were carcinogenic particles in the baby powder that were the same as asbestos that would cause mesothelioma. Not only did they know it, but they buried the research. That's why they got such a big fine. And these are the guys that are making some of this so-called medication for this pandemic. So I want you to think about that. One of the biggest
They're
court
criminal
cases,
organisations, and that's not a conspiracy.
That's not the only
I'm talking
one.
about all the pharmaceutical companies.
Absolutely.
I was reading a document. Oh, man, I don't even know. See, so much has happened over the last 3 years. I don't know when it was, but it was just in recent history. And I think, I don't know, it was 34 billion. All the pharmaceutical companies, and these are your Pfizers, your Modernas, your Johnson & Johnsons, all these companies, when I say the biggest criminal organisations in the world, they might not be the biggest, but they're the biggest fines. They're the biggest ones that have been caught, I guess we can say. The biggest fines to ever be paid out in the history of the world are from these pharmaceutical companies, and it's tens of billions of dollars.
And even then, Brett,
then we're asked to trust them.
Where does that money go? Where do the fines go?
The government.
So we had babies getting killed with this baby powder. And by the way, it's still for sale in some countries. They know it causes damage, and they're still
and they tried to cover it up.
They try to cover it up. And who's in jail?
No one.
The company got a fine. The company acted as a person, and that carried the penalty. And you had scientists, you had bean counters, you had accountants, you had doctors, you had, I don't know, experts. And these guys have still got their jobs. Maybe they got moved sideways, maybe somebody got fired, but nobody went to jail for murder.
No,
this
right.
is disgusting.
Wow, people hanging off ropes. And then with Pfizer, and we'll talk about Pfizer, because they tried to suppress their information because their findings came out, and they tried to suppress it for 55 years.
Wasn't it more? Wasn't it 72?
No, there's a couple of different articles I've read, and I first thought it was 72. I'm going to say 55 for safety, but they tried to suppress it for years and years and years till most people would be dead. I don't think I'll be here in 55 years. I'm 46 right now. But anyway, most people wouldn't remember anyway, but in 55 years' time, let's put it that way. And but the government made them put it out over the period of 8 months or a year or something.
Even that's despicable. But if you had nothing to hide, if you were acting in best interests,
where's the transparency?
Would you suppress something?
No,
let's not look
not.
at that.
Yeah.
So the evidence again. I mean, for people, listen. Do with what we're saying. Do that with that information what you will. But I'll tell you what. The more you pull all these little factors together, I'll tell you what. If you're a solicitor or a lawyer, it's presenting a fairly damning case for the fact that one, the government isn't working in our favor. There is a global agenda against humanity, and it is about depopulating us. And there's external control. If people think Australia is being run by Australians or by Canberra, they've got to start waking up and smelling the coffee. They're dreaming. Australia's being run externally. It's been run through Europe.
It's craziness, isn't it? Well, Albo's over there right now with NATO. We're not a North Atlantic Treaty Organisation member. Like, what? Why is Australia over there NATO meeting?
They've approved another defence contract.
Yeah, for Rheinmetall, who's a German company making the boxes. Yeah, here in Queensland, in Ipswich, and we're going to give them all our thing. I'm like, the whole thing's. If it wasn't so backward, I don't know. But I was going to finish off at the Pfizer point because we've run out of time on my show today, but we are going to continue the conversation because you're going to put it up on BitChute and YouTube. Can you tell the people... Oh, actually, let me finish this point and then we'll say that because I've got to... and because we'll continue on. But just to finish up on the Pfizer point, trying to suppress it 55 years, then there was an article that was peer-reviewed. Dr. Peter McCulloch was talking about it the other day on a... I forgot what show he was talking about it. The Lancet. The Lancet, which is like the premier medical journal. So if something goes on there, it's pretty well accepted by most or by all. The Lancet put an article on there about those Pfizer documents and what they tried to suppress, and they knew before it went out just how bad and how many adverse reactions there were, and it started getting downloaded at hundreds per second. Hundreds and hundreds per second was getting downloaded off the Lancet. 18 hours after they put it up, and this showed that 74% of the people that died from COVID died from vaccine adverse reactions, not from COVID, is what this article was saying. They pulled it from Lancet. So after 18 hours it lasted up there, and it was peer-reviewed, it was proper document, and all it was researching autopsies, which Why aren't governments doing more autopsies right now? Because again, where's the transparency? You want to find out. All-cause morbidity in Australia is up, I think it's 15% overall. Some states are a little less, some's a little higher, but for the whole country, and that's through the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it's over 15% all-cause morbidity. If it ever goes up by 3 or 4%, that's an anomaly that needs to be investigated. What the hell's going on? It's 15%. There's no investigations. No states are really keen to do autopsies.
Let's carry that one on to the second part, because that's the stuff that'll get my channel
Okay.
a strike, believe it or not. That's incredible that I got to say that, isn't it? In a so-called free world with free
Well,
speech.
the Lancet put this document up. I didn't put it up.
And that information can give me a strike on YouTube.
Mate, and we'll, in a few, if this bill goes through, it'll get us a fine.
Yep.
Not just a strike on YouTube. And this is what's disgusting, because we should be able to talk about it. People are allowed to be wrong.
Yes.
People, and I'm not saying I'm right or I'm wrong. I believe what I'm saying to be right, but you should be able to have an opinion. In a free and democratic world or a country, you should be able to ask questions, have healthy debate, and have opinions. And yeah, you're allowed to. I work with people that I disagree with vehemently on some points, but you know what? I would fight to the death for them to have the right to express that opinion, even though I think it's wrong.
100%.
And so anyway, what I'll do is we'll wrap up the conversation today, and I'm sorry for the listeners that want to hear the answer to this question. We are going to continue this conversation. How can they find the rest of this conversation?
So I've rebranded a little bit, but if you can still find me on YouTube through Awakening in Health, and my email, send me an email, dennis@awakeninginhealth.com, and I'm also on a platform called BitChute where I put out where information doesn't get censored as much. Yeah. But yeah, I'll chuck the first part of this on my YouTube channel, and then we'll continue to chat, and I'll put the rest of it on the BitChute channel.
Is it Dennis with 2 N's?
2 N's, yeah, good point. DENNIS.
Dennis@awakeninginhealth.com. Well, listeners, this hour's gone pretty quick. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. For everyone else, kick over to Awakening in Health's BitChute or YouTube, and we'll continue on there.